Hey there, audit fans. Welcome to my video on the exposure draft for ISA315. Now, I know that for a lot of these videos, I've just dived straight into the standards. I wanted to start this one on camera because ISA315 or ISA315 means a lot to me. And you might think, what does that mean? This was the standard that I did my PhD thesis on about how auditors understand and gather an understanding about the entity. I'll talk about that one day, maybe in a future video. But 315 has evolved so much, and it's the foundation of the audit. And what we're seeing in this exposure draft of the new ISA 315 proposed by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board is some amazing stuff. So I'm super pumped about this standard. I hope you are too. And let's dive into it. Into our exposure draft, and you'll notice here on the cover I'm looking at the exposure draft for ASA 315, but the ISA 315 exposure draft is exactly the same. I'm looking at the Australian one. That's the one I've printed out and I have here next to me beside my computer, and I'll be providing feedback on this one as well to the International or the Australian Auditing Standards Board. Now, I've removed some of the pages just to make it easier to navigate for us looking online, but you'll notice that there are some new areas within the standard. Now, it always starts with the scope. The scope is nothing new, but what I really like is we see some new things on key concepts, all right? And there's some slightly, the explanatory material is still great. So when you go into the explanatory material, remember explanatory material is the how-to components here. If you're wondering, what do I need to gather to understand the entity and their business model, then Appendix 1 has hundreds of items for you to look at. So these are still really great and detailed, and I guess even more, they've been expanded compared to what they used to be. And this is a common theme within the exposure draft, is that we're seeing a lot more detail in a lot of different areas, and I think that's really useful. Conformity statement, so definitely ISA 315, the proposed exposure draft, and the ASA one are identical. There are a few little extra Australian paragraphs that are in there, but as I mentioned before, this is the really exciting bit here, key concepts. I like that this is at the beginning, it's setting the tone, and it's providing a place for the standard. We know that this is an important foundation standard, but it really helps set the scene of what we want to do. It reminds us about ASA 200 and our objectives to get sufficient appropriate evidence, to reduce audit risk to a low level, and to give our audit opinion. And it's really nice and clear here that it says audit risk is a function of the risk of material misstatement and detection risk, and that the risk of material misstatement may come at the overall financial statement level or at the assertion level, and they can come from inherent risks or control risks. And we've got a nice little definition of inherent risk, and then when we flick across the page, we have a nice little description of control risk. All of these key concepts are really about grounding the auditor and setting the foundation for the rest of the standard. What I also really like about this section is there's some really clear instructions on what to do in the audit. So the identification of risks of material misstatement at the assertion level is performed before we consider any controls. Now, this is a really nice, clear instruction so that as a new auditor or as a student, you understand the order of tasks. We identify risks, and then we consider the possibility of testing controls if we believe controls are available to be relied on. Now, it also says here, for the identified risks of material misstatement, we need to look at the inherent and control risks, and The degree to which inherent risk varies is referred to as the spectrum of inherent risk. And this is really important because risks could be low risk, medium risk, high risk. Not everything that might pop up as an inherent risk is going to be something that you're going to want to do something specific about in terms of planning the audit. Now, the standard in paragraph 6 also gives another nice clear instruction. The auditor may identify specific controls that addresses a risk of misstatement and that I can intend to test it for operating effectiveness. Remember, that is a situation where our detection risk is high and we're going for that lower of assessed level of control risk or controls testing type of approach. One last thing that I really want to bring up down here, obviously there's some stuff we already know. Risk of material misstatement could be due to fraud or error, that's nothing new. But it's this section here, paragraph 9, the iterative nature of the risk assessment process. And it says that our risk assessment process is both iterative and dynamic. So that means that you go through iterations. You don't just make a risk assessment once and you're done. As you gather more information, your risk assessment process needs to reflect that. And your risk assessment of the client also needs to have the possibility of change. All right? It needs to be able to adapt to new information that you find. It needs to be flexible. And that means that you could find information while you're testing internal controls that might change our risk assessment process or our understanding of risk at the client. So this idea of being adaptable and flexible, while it was mentioned before, it is being emphasized quite a lot more in this new exposure draft. Going back to nice clear instructions, paragraph 10 here, after we identify the risks, I have to determine the significant issues, all right? And then stand back to confirm that I've done the right thing. So I'm looking up close to try and identify the risks and which ones are significant, which ones are critical, I want to do something about in the planning stage, and then stand back. Think, does this all seem right? Take a step back, look at it. I would probably, in this stand back and discuss, also have some team discussion to make sure that everybody knows what's going on here, and that we need to really consider a whole range of issues from a broad perspective, all right? Not just looking detailed at the company, but standing back and having a look. We also have some information about scalability for smaller companies as well as larger companies. Scalability was something we always talked about in the past anyway. That's not particularly new, but it is expanded a little bit in some more detail. So when we scroll down, the objective of the ISA is still the same, identify risks of material misstatement. We have a much greater expansion in the definition section now. So there's, I think, twice as many items in the definitions. Lots of these things like application controls, business risk. A lot of this was covered before in the explanatory material and it's brought back into the definition. So I like this. It's nice and clear up front. There's going to be no quibbling about what an application control is or what a business risk is. That's really important because business risk versus inherent risk is often an area that is highly confusing for my students, potentially as well as new auditors. We scroll down, we've got lots more descriptions here. We've got controls, general IT controls, inherent risk factors. This one's going to be critical for my students, understanding inherent risks, the IT environment, knowing about what assertions might be relevant, risk assessment procedures, and key, significant risk, because that's what we're doing here. In this task, the standard requires us to identify these significant risks. So there are risks of material misstatement which, scrolling over and going across the page, Let's look at this. For the risk, the assessment of inherent risk is close to the upper end of the spectrum of inherent risk due to the possibility of what might happen, due to the likelihood or the magnitude. All right, so that's key, upper end of the spectrum, and that's going to be a significant risk in accordance with our ISAs. So that's really nice and clear now. It was difficult before to determine what would be significant. We now know upper end of the spectrum of inherent risk. So what exactly are the requirements? Remember, the requirements are the things we have to do. Design and perform risk assessment procedures to understand the entity and its environment, the applicable financial reporting framework, and the system of internal control. So those are the things that we must know about so that we can obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence as the basis for the identification of the assessment of risks of material misstatement. All right, so here it's saying we need to know this information to be able to identify significant risks. And then in ISA330, we're going to talk about how we actually respond or do something about those risks in an audit. There's now clear instructions about what we should do in terms of the risk assessment. And there's some specific information. I really like this bit. The engagement partner and other key team members shall discuss how they apply the applicable financial reporting framework and the susceptibility of the entity's financial report to material misstatement. All right, so this team discussion part, again, is really important, making sure everybody is on the same page. Now, if we scroll down a bit more, now we get into the, essentially, it's what does the auditor need to know? So this is the information gathering that auditors need to do to be able to understand their entity. All right, and this is what it all comes down to. It all comes down to understanding the entity and their environment so that they can identify these significant risks. So, entity and the environment have some specific things. The applicable financial reporting framework, are we using US GAAP, Australian accounting standards, international financial reporting standards? So, there are three things that we need to understand. Number one is the entity and the environment. Number two is the applicable financial reporting framework. And number three that the standard requires us to look at, which has its own heading, is the system of internal control. And we've always had to look at that. I've talked about this before. I like to use the triangle analogy of the control environment at the bottom, risk assessment, control activities, monitoring and information systems. When you go across here, again, it's going to talk about what goes into the control environment. What are the things we're looking at for risk assessment? Something that's really interesting from my perspective in control environment is now this new section, which demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop and retain competent individuals aligned with their objectives. And do they hold individuals accountable for their responsibilities? Another key one that's really important to me, and especially because of the Royal Banking Commission we've had in Australia, we've seen lots of poor company values, is a commitment to integrity and ethics. I really like that as an inclusion now in the control environment. There is plenty of stuff on risk assessment. We need to look at how the client assesses risk. Then it goes through to look at monitoring. Remember, I was talking about monitoring as the apex of that pyramid, the information systems and communication. Whoops. And then at the end, they have control activities. All right, so control activities are those things that prevent or detect material misstatements. Now, an interesting part here is controls relevant to the audit, and this is, I guess, a little bit more expanded. And for my students, they're often asking me, which controls are the ones that are really important? How do I know which ones? And there is a little paragraph, and we need to identify controls that are related to the financial statements, but there's a paragraph that says, not all controls are relevant to financial reporting on the audit. Right, you might find some controls that are important for the business that are not related to financial reporting, we have to use our professional judgment to determine whether a control is relevant. So that's something that I think you'll need to practice a little bit as the auditor. It's always happened, but now there's a lot more detail on internal controls that in the past was contained within the explanatory material. Now, one thing that I think does need a little bit more attention, I think, is this one here, control deficiencies within systems of internal controls. And it says that if we have control deficiencies, we need to figure out whether they're significant. Now, the standard does reference back to A265 or ISA315, which I have talked about, but there is no definition for significant control deficiency within 315. That's the one thing I think is probably missing here. I know it's in 265, but I think it would be nice to have it here as well. I think it's worth repeating to keep it within that standard. And then at the very end here, identifying the risks of material misstatement. Remember, this is our output. All right, the standard from 315 requires us, so 315 says, go away and get this understanding, all right, which is really knowledge about the firm. Build a mental picture so that then your output is going to be identifying these risks. All right, those inherent risks that are on the higher end of the spectrum that are more likely to require extra audit attention. All right, and that's the key, extra audit work. Oops, I can't spell. Extra audit work is going to need to come out for these particular areas. Now that might mean you're going to have a lot of risks. Quite often when I get students to brainstorm risks, they will have many, and we need to figure out, well, which of these are going to be at the financial statement level, and which of these are going to be at the assertion level, and determine, well, how are we going to respond to those? Now that's in a separate standard, but we need to be able to identify those risks, and that's what 315 is all about. 315 is all about this identification process. Now, I'm going to dig into just a few more parts of the standard here. The first one is the revision of risk assessment. Remember I talked before about how there's a section that says that the risk process, the assessment process is iterative and dynamic. Well, right here we have that same idea put in or emphasized, that our risk assessment, our risk of material misstatement, may change during the course of the audit due to additional evidence, right? And that information might be inconsistent with what we might have, and then we shall revise the assessment and modify our planned audit response. All right? Again, that's that adaptive, flexible idea of the audit. We shouldn't just stick on one audit plan and move forward. There's now a section, There's a section on documentation. That's nothing really special, but documenting our work I've talked about and its importance. And then we get into the explanatory material. Now, I don't usually dig into explanatory material on standards, and I'm not going to go into all of the explanatory material because it's another 50 pages, but I want to talk specifically about this information here about inherent risk factors. And identifying inherent risks is often a difficult thing. They could be qualitative or quantitative, but quite often qualitative risks have commonalities. And this here gives us some principles to which to work by. Complexity, so things that might be more complex than others, things that might be more subjective, risks that might be more susceptible to a change in conditions. So revenue recognition, for example, is a big one, and leases is going to be a big inherent risk no matter what firm because of the changes to the standards. If there's more uncertainty, or if there's susceptibility due to management bias or fraud. So I really like the inclusion of these extra principles, I guess, in the explanatory material to help you filter and determine which inherent risk, if you can link it to a change, uncertainty, susceptibility, complexity, etc., the 5, then you're much clearer on knowing that it's an inherent risk. There is plenty more about significant risks to actually dig into here there's plenty more to dig into about significant risks from paragraph A10 and how to do the risk assessment in the appendices. I'm not going to go into all of the explanatory material. The assertions are still here, but they've moved back a bit. I think the assertions are now in paragraph, and I've just checked my notes here, A204. All right, so that's the assertions, whereas previously they were, I think in the current version, A128. They're now in 204. That tells you that there's a lot more in the explanatory material than ever before. It's great that we're giving auditors more guidance. What are my thoughts to sum up, I guess, on the new standards? So, to sum up, things I like, all right? And there's a couple of things that I really like. I like the new inherent risk in the explanatory paragraphs. I think that that is really great that we have these 5 sort of components to think about. What I also really like is the level of detail in the standards. There's now lots of clear instructions, and from my perspective, that's useful from a teacher's point of view, because it helps students understand where this particular standard fits within the entire audit process. I think that'll be useful if you're a smaller audit firm and you don't have a big firm methodology behind it. So I like that it's detailed and that there's lots of clear instruction. I also like all the extra information about inherent risk and control risk now in the standard. That's really great. The only thing that I think does need something so far in my first reading of the new standard is the definition of significant control deficiencies. I know that's already included in ISA315, but I would like to see it here again just in case. That's my thoughts on the new exposure draft. I'd love to hear yours in the comments. If you have any questions, pop them there. If you are really interested in this area, the international board and the Australian board are taking feedback. I will be preparing a submission of feedback from my perspective as an educator. So thank you very much for watching. If you thought the video was useful, I'd love for you to give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.